David Chen owned the morning. He moved through his empire with the precision of a man who had never learned to doubt himself, who had buried doubt so deep that it rarely clawed its way to the surface anymore. 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the city would fully wake, before his executives would file in with their careful smiles and calculated deference. 20 years of hunger had carved him into something sharp and unforgiving. The financial magazines called him ruthless. His board called him effective. His competitors called him inevitable. He wore these labels like armor, each one proof that the boy who had once believed in fairness, who had once believed in other things, softer things, was truly dead. The elevator chimed. Someone arriving early, probably Martinez from legal. David kept his eyes on the quarterly projections, fingers dancing across numbers that told stories of conquest. The cleaning cart squeaked past his peripheral vision, background noise, invisible people maintaining his visible world. Then she dropped something, papers scattered across marble like fallen leaves, and irritation flickered through him before he looked up. A woman in gray uniform knelt among the mess, dark hair curtaining her face. Something about the way she moved, careful, apologetic, tugged at memories he had spent 20 years learning not to remember. She looked up. His heart stopped. Actually stopped, then hammered against his ribs like something caged and desperate. The air left his lungs in a rush that felt like falling, like the moment between stepping off a cliff and hitting the ground. Sarah Kim. 20 years collapsed into nothing. Those same brown eyes, wider now with something that might have been fear, might have been recognition, might have been the same gut punch of loss that was currently destroying him from the inside out. Her hands trembled as she gathered the scattered documents, and he knew, God, he knew that she recognized him too. The boy who had loved her rose from whatever grave he'd been buried in, clawing toward the surface with memories sharp enough to cut. Summer nights when they'd planned their future, coffee shop dreams that had tasted like forever. The way she'd looked at him the last time he'd seen her, when he'd chosen his empire over everything else that mattered. Sarah scrambled to her feet, mumbling apologies about the disturbance, about covering someone else's route, about needing to finish the floor. The words were professional, distant, but her voice carried undertones of something harder, something that recognized him not as a stranger, but as the architect of disappointments she'd stopped talking about years ago. She addressed him as Mr. Chen, formal as winter, cold as the contracts that had built his fortune. Once, she'd whispered his name like a prayer. Once, she'd called him hers, and he had been fool enough to believe that belonging to someone was weakness rather than strength. The elevator doors opened like an escape hatch. She pushed her cart toward them, wheels squeaking a funeral march for whatever they had once been. He watched her retreat and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart, because hearts were luxuries he'd given up long ago, but something deeper, something structural. The doors closed. David stood among everything he had once called victory, and for the first time realized he had lost. 3 weeks passed like sleepwalking. David found himself arriving earlier each morning, though he told himself it had nothing to do with the cleaning schedules. His productivity plummeted, a fact his assistant mentioned with increasing concern. Quarterly reports sat unread. Merger proposals gathered dust. He caught himself staring at empty hallways, waiting for the squeak of wheels that never came. She had been reassigned. Of course she had. Someone in facilities management possessed enough sense to keep the help invisible, especially when the help had somehow rattled the CEO. David could have found out where with a single phone call. He didn't make the call. He told himself it was professionalism. The lie lasted exactly 18 days. On a Tuesday that felt like drowning, he saw her again. Not on his floor this time, but in the lobby during his lunch return. A glimpse of gray uniform disappearing behind a marble pillar. His heart performed gymnastics he thought it had forgotten. By the time he reached the spot, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of industrial cleaner and something else. Something that might have been the perfume she used to wear. Memory became his enemy. It ambushed him in elevators, reminding him how she used to laugh at his terrible jokes. It struck during board meetings, showing him her face when she was 19 and believed in him completely. It followed him home to his penthouse, where silence echoed off walls that cost more than most people's houses. Sarah Kim had been his first everything, first love, first heartbreak, first lesson in how the world worked when you had nothing to offer but dreams. They had planned their future over coffee that cost less than his current tie. She would teach elementary school. He would start his own company. They would change the world together, one small kindness at a time. The boy who made those promises was a stranger now. David studied old photos of himself from college. Soft features, easy smile, eyes that still believed good intentions mattered. He looked like someone's younger brother, someone harmless. What happened to that boy wasn't tragedy, it was evolution. The third sighting came during a late evening when most of the building had emptied. David was leaving a brutal session with his legal team, another company to devour, another batch of employees to scatter, when he spotted her mopping the lobby floors. She moved with systematic efficiency, each stroke deliberate. Her hair was pulled back severely. She had lost more weight. This time, he didn't let her escape. He approached slowly, as if she might bolt. She sensed him before she saw him, that animal awareness that comes from years of needing to be invisible. When she looked up, her face went through a series of micro-expressions. Recognition, resignation, something that might have been anger. She continued mopping. He stood there like an idiot, watching her work around his expensive shoes. The lobby stretched between them, marble and glass, and 20 years of choices that couldn't be undone. He wanted to say her name again, wanted to ask how she ended up here, wanted to demand why she looked at him like he was something dangerous. Instead, he watched her hands. They were older now, marked by work and worry. No wedding ring, but the pale band of skin suggested there had been one recently. Her nails were short and practical. Once he had kissed those fingers and promised they would never know real hardship. She finished the section around his feet and moved on, creating distance with professional precision. He followed at a respectful distance, matching her pace through the lobby. They performed a strange dance, her working, him observing, both pretending this was normal. Near the security desk, she finally spoke, not to him, but to the guard, asking about schedule changes for next week. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to make herself small. The guard barely looked up from his magazine, grunting responses that showed exactly where she ranked in the building's ecosystem. David felt something crack inside his chest. This woman who had once lit up rooms was invisible here. Furniture with a heartbeat. He wanted to tell the guard who she was, what she had been to him, how she had been the first person to see something worth believing in when he was nobody. But what was the point? The guard would see his boss defending the help and draw his own conclusions. Sarah would see his intervention as pity or worse, obligation, and he would be left with the truth that hurt most of all. He had no right to defend her anymore. She finished her rounds and headed toward the service elevator. This time, David didn't follow. He stood in his marble lobby, surrounded by his empire's monuments to success, and felt more alone than he had in 20 years. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stood at his penthouse windows, looking down at the city he had helped shape through ruthless efficiency. Somewhere down there, Sarah was going home to whatever life she had built from the wreckage of their shared past. He wondered if she ever thought about the boy he used to be. He wondered if she mourned that boy the way he was starting to. The next morning, he made the call to HR, just to check her employment status, he told himself, just to make sure she was being treated fairly. Professional interest. Nothing more. The HR file landed on his desk like evidence of a crime he didn't remember committing. Sarah Kim, 41. Employed through Consolidated Cleaning Services, one of the subcontractors that kept his building spotless and anonymous. 2 years with the company, satisfactory performance ratings, no disciplinary actions, previous employment, scattered retail positions, substitute teaching that lasted 8 months, a brief stint at a call center. Address: a neighborhood David recognized as the kind of place where hope went to die slowly. He stared at the paper until the words blurred. Somewhere between the clinical language and bureaucratic stamps lay the story of what happened to dreams. His dreams had become steel and glass towers. Hers had become night shifts and minimum wage. David closed the file and tried to return to his morning routine. The Japanese investors were flying in next week. The Henderson acquisition needed his signature. His empire demanded attention. But Sarah's employment record had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter, sharp and impossible to ignore. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. He found her on the 38th floor at 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday. The office lights had been dimmed to their overnight setting, casting long shadows between the cubicles. She worked with headphones on, moving through her tasks with the same methodical precision he remembered from her studying. Always focused, always giving her best effort to whatever was in front of her. She sensed him before she heard him, that survival instinct he'd noticed before. The headphones came off. Her face went carefully neutral. He had rehearsed this moment. Casual conversation. Professional concern for a valued service provider. Maybe a subtle inquiry about her well-being. Instead, he stood there like a teenager who'd forgotten his lines. She continued cleaning, wiping down desks that were already clean, staying busy, staying safe. The silence stretched between them until it became unbearable. Finally, he spoke about coincidences, about how strange it was to see someone from the past, about how she looked well. The lies came easier when he didn't look directly at her. She responded with careful politeness. Yes, it was a small world. Yes, she was fine. Thank you for asking, Mr. Chen. The formal distance in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. He tried a different approach, asked about her family, her life, whether she was happy. The questions sounded patronizing, even to his own ears. The concern of a wealthy man slumming among the working class, but he needed to know, needed to understand the chain of choices that led her here. Her answers came in careful, measured doses. She'd been married. It didn't work out. She was getting by. Managing fine. No children, thankfully, a comment delivered with such quiet pain that it stopped his breath. The conversation felt like surgery without anesthesia. Every response revealed another wound, another dream that had been sacrificed to reality. He found himself wanting to fix things, to write checks, to use his power to solve whatever had broken in her life. The urge was so strong it made his hands shake. Then he made his mistake. He mentioned opportunities, suggested that perhaps there were better positions available at Apex Dynamics, executive assistant roles, administrative work that would suit someone with her intelligence and education. He could make some calls, pull some strings, help her get back on her feet. She stopped cleaning. The transformation was subtle but complete. Her shoulders straightened, her eyes sharpened. When she looked at him, really looked at him, he saw something that made him step backward. Her response came in a voice he'd never heard from her before. Cold, precise, surgical in its accuracy. She thanked him for his generous offer, explained that she hadn't asked for his charity, reminded him that she was perfectly capable of managing her own career. The word charity landed like a slap. She used it twice more before she was done, but she wasn't done. 20 years of suppressed anger poured out in measured, devastating sentences. She spoke about assumptions, about wealthy men who thought their money could fix problems they had helped create, about the arrogance of offering crumbs from tables they had built on others' backs. David tried to interrupt, to explain his intentions, but her words kept coming. She talked about dignity, about the difference between help and pity, about how some bridges were burned for good reason. The attack was precise and personal. She dissected his offer with the same methodical care she brought to cleaning, showing him exactly how it looked from her perspective. A powerful man throwing money at an uncomfortable situation, a guilt payment wrapped in false kindness. She finished by asking him to stay away from her, to let her do her job without his supervision or concern. She could manage her own life without input from someone who clearly thought so little of her that he assumed she needed rescue. The last words were the ones that destroyed him. She called him David, not Mr. Chen, for the first time since their reunion, but she said it like a curse, like the name of someone who had betrayed everything good between them. Then she gathered her supplies and left. The elevator closed on her rigid back and his shattered assumptions. David stood alone among the empty cubicles, surrounded by the detritus of other people's ambitions. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects. His reflection stared back from the darkened windows, a successful man who had just been stripped naked by someone who cleaned his floors. He had expected gratitude, recognition of his generosity, perhaps even a hint of their old connection. Instead, he had been shown exactly what he looked like through her eyes. Another rich man who thought his money could buy absolution. The worst part was that she wasn't wrong. He stood there until the security guard made his rounds, pretending to work late. The guard barely acknowledged him. Why would he question the CEO's presence in his own building? David envied the man's simple certainties, his clear understanding of hierarchy and place. On the drive home, David replayed every word of their confrontation. Sarah's anger had been magnificent and terrible, a glimpse of the fire he remembered from their college days. She had always been able to see through him, to call him on his bullshit with surgical precision. Some things apparently never changed. What had changed was his ability to handle her honesty. 20 years of yes men and careful diplomacy had left him unprepared for someone who owed him nothing and feared him even less. The boy she used to love would have understood her anger, would have seen his offer through her eyes and been ashamed. But that boy was gone, replaced by someone who thought problems could be solved with the right amount of money and influence. For the first time in years, David Chen had been reminded that he was wrong about something that mattered. The unraveling began with a phone call David shouldn't have made. Marcus Webb from the private investigation firm answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who specialized in other people's secrets. David had used his services before: due diligence on merger targets, background checks on potential board members, the usual corporate paranoia that kept empires intact. This request was different. David told himself he needed to understand. Sarah's anger had been too raw, too specific. Her accusations about tables built on others' backs hadn't felt like generic rage against the wealthy. They had felt personal, targeted, like she knew something he didn't about his own success story. Webb promised discretion and results within a week. David hung up, feeling like he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, but the need to know burned stronger than his guilt. The guilt would come later. Meanwhile, Sarah's world continued its quiet collapse in ways David couldn't see from his glass tower. Her confrontation with him had cost her sleep she couldn't afford to lose. The memory of his condescending offer played on repeat during her other jobs: the weekend shifts at the discount grocery store, the early morning house cleaning for families who treated her like animated furniture. She had been surviving on a careful balance of work and debt management since Richard left. Her ex-husband had taken half of nothing and still managed to leave her worse off than before. The divorce settlement had been generous in its division of their shared failures: the medical bills from her father's final year, the credit card debt from trying to keep their small business afloat, the mortgage on a house they could never afford. Richard had remarried within 6 months. His new wife was younger, prettier, and crucially, came with a trust fund that made their money problems disappear. Sarah tried not to hate her, but the effort was exhausting. The confrontation with David had shaken something loose in her careful emotional architecture. For 20 years, she had avoided thinking about the boy who had promised to build something beautiful with her. The boy who had believed that success meant lifting others up, not climbing over them. Seeing what he had become, the casual arrogance, the assumption that money could fix anything, had been like watching someone desecrate a grave. But it had also awakened questions she had spent decades suppressing. What if she had stayed? What if she had followed him to the East Coast instead of remaining here for her sick mother? What if she had been stronger, greedier, more willing to compromise her principles for financial security? The what-ifs were poison, but she couldn't stop swallowing them. David's empire, meanwhile, was showing its first cracks. The Henderson acquisition, which should have been a routine expansion, hit an unexpected snag. Environmental lawyers representing a coalition of community groups had filed an injunction claiming the deal would result in massive layoffs and environmental damage. The case was weak legally, but strong politically. Local news had picked up the story, painting Apex Dynamics as a corporate predator feeding on small-town America. Board member Jennifer Torres cornered David after the emergency meeting, her expression carefully neutral in the way that signaled maximum danger. The other members had filed out with their usual murmurs of confidence, but Torres remained. She spoke about optics, about the importance of maintaining Apex Dynamics' reputation for responsible growth, about certain rumors she'd heard regarding David's recent behavior, late nights in the building, unusual requests to HR, distraction during crucial meetings. David deflected with practiced ease, but Torres wasn't finished. She mentioned consolidated cleaning services, how interesting it was that their contract had been renewed early with improved terms, how unusual it was for the CEO to personally involve himself in facilities management. The conversation ended with Torres suggesting that David might benefit from taking some personal time. A vacation, perhaps a sabbatical to focus on strategic planning. The words were supportive, but the message was clear. The board was watching. David left the meeting feeling like he was losing control of something he had built with his own hands. The empire that had felt permanent and impregnable suddenly seemed fragile, held together by the confidence of men and women who could withdraw their support as easily as they had given it. That evening, Webb called with his preliminary findings. Sarah's story emerged in fragments that cut like glass. The teaching career that ended when budget cuts eliminated her position. The small business, a tutoring center she had started with Richard, that failed when a larger chain moved into their area. The medical debt from her father's cancer treatment, accumulated during months when insurance companies found creative ways to deny coverage. But it was the final piece of information that stopped David's breath entirely. Sarah's tutoring center had been located in the Millfield Plaza, a small shopping complex on the city's south side. The complex had been sold 3 years ago to a development firm that demolished it to make way for luxury condominiums. The development firm was a subsidiary of Rockwell Holdings, which had been acquired by Apex Dynamics in a merger that David remembered as particularly profitable. The numbers swam in front of his eyes. Dates, transactions, corporate shells designed to obscure responsibility. But the truth was undeniable. His company had destroyed her business, not directly, not personally, but through the impersonal machinery of capitalism that he had built and refined. David sat in his office at midnight, surrounded by the documentation of his success, and felt like he was drowning. The city spread out below him, a grid of lights representing millions of lives affected by his decisions. How many other Sarah Kims were down there? How many dreams had been crushed to build his empire? The phone rang. Webb again, with more details. Sarah's current address was in a complex that had been sold twice in the past 2 years, each time to investment firms that raised rents and cut services. The current owner was planning to convert the buildings to condominiums, forcing out longtime tenants who couldn't afford the new prices. David asked about the ownership chain. The answer, when it came, was exactly what he feared. 3 layers of shell companies led back to Hartwell Investments, a real estate fund that Apex Dynamics had created to diversify their portfolio. He was her landlord, had been for 8 months. The irony was so perfect it felt orchestrated by a malicious god. She was working multiple jobs to pay rent to companies he owned, in a building he was planning to flip for profit after her business had been destroyed by his expansion strategy. The invisible hand of the market wasn't invisible at all. It was his hand, reaching into her life and squeezing. David stood at his windows, looking down at the city he had helped shape, and understood for the first time why Sarah had looked at him like he was dangerous. He was dangerous, not personally, not intentionally, but systematically. His success was a machine that consumed dreams and converted them into quarterly profits. The worst part was the efficiency of it all. No single decision had been malicious. Each acquisition, each development, each investment had been justified by sound business logic. The tutoring center was simply collateral damage in a larger strategy. The apartment complex was just an underperforming asset that needed optimization. But Sarah wasn't collateral damage. She was the woman he had once loved, grinding herself to dust to pay rent to companies he owned. David opened his laptop and began researching Hartwell Investments. If he was going to destroy his own empire, he needed to understand exactly how he had built it. Sarah's accusations about tables built on others' backs deserved a thorough audit. By dawn, he had filled 3 legal pads with notes. The picture that emerged was of a system so complex and interconnected that moral responsibility became impossible to trace. But at the center of the web sat David Chen, the spider who had forgotten he was feeding on flies. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. The Japanese investors had moved up their arrival. The Henderson deal needed his immediate attention. 3 more companies had expressed interest in being acquired. David stared at the messages until they blurred. His empire demanded feeding, but he was finally beginning to understand the cost of that hunger. Outside his windows, the city woke up to another day. Somewhere in the maze of streets and buildings, Sarah was probably getting ready for work. Another day of cleaning up other people's messes, of being invisible to the people whose lives she maintained. The boy who had once promised to change the world with her was finally ready to keep that promise, even if it meant destroying everything he had built in the meantime. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that would later mark the end of everything David thought he knew about himself. It came through corporate mail, addressed to him personally, marked private and confidential. The envelope was thin, cheap, the kind used by people who couldn't afford to waste money on presentation. His assistant had placed it on top of his morning briefings, probably assuming it was another investor inquiry or acquisition proposal. David recognized the handwriting before he processed the name in the return address. 20 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition. Sarah Kim, 1247 Riverside Apartments, Unit 12B, the address he now knew he owned. His hands shook as he opened it. The letter inside was written on notebook paper, the kind with blue lines that children use for school assignments. Her handwriting was exactly the same, neat, careful, every letter formed with the precision of someone who had once wanted to teach children to read. The words were different. She had discovered the truth, not through investigation or suspicion, but through the mundane cruelty of bureaucracy. Her rent increase notice had included new corporate letterhead, Hartwell Investments, a subsidiary of Apex Dynamics. David's signature, stamped and authorized, appeared at the bottom of the document that would force her from her home. The letter was 3 pages of quiet devastation. She wrote about the tutoring center, about the dreams that had died when the demolition crews arrived. She wrote about working 16-hour days to pay rent to the man who had destroyed her business. She wrote about the mathematics of her daily humiliation, cleaning the offices of the company that was slowly strangling her financial future. But it was the final paragraph that destroyed him completely. She had kept his old letters, all of them, the ones where he had promised to build something beautiful together, the ones where he had sworn that his success would mean lifting others up, not climbing over them. She had carried those promises for 20 years, like love letters from a ghost. Now she was returning them, all of them, in a box she had left with building security. The letter ended with 2 sentences that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. "You became exactly what we used to fight against. I hope your empire was worth it." David sat in his office, surrounded by the monuments to his success, and felt his world cracking apart. The city spread out below him, millions of lives touched by his decisions, thousands of businesses affected by his acquisitions, hundreds of communities reshaped by his investments. How many other Sarah Kims were down there? How many other broken promises lay buried beneath his empire's foundation? The box arrived an hour later. Security called to announce its delivery, their voices carefully neutral. David imagined them laughing about it later. The big-shot CEO receiving packages from the cleaning lady. He picked it up himself, ignoring the surprised looks from his executive team. Inside were 43 letters, rubber-banded by year. His younger self stared back at him from pages of earnest promises and impossible dreams. The boy who had written these letters was a stranger, someone who believed that business could be a force for good, that wealth could be a tool for justice, that success meant bringing others along for the journey. David read every letter. 20 years of naive idealism preserved in faded ink and yellowed paper, plans for a company that would prioritize people over profits, promises to remember where he came from, vows that he would never become the kind of man who treated workers as expendable resources. The boy who had written these letters wouldn't recognize the man reading them. By noon, David had made a decision that would either redeem him or destroy everything he had built. He called Webb and gave him a new assignment. Investigate every acquisition, every merger, every development project that Apex Dynamics had ever undertaken. Find the human cost. Document the casualties. Create a comprehensive audit of his empire's collateral damage. Webb protested the scope and expense of such an investigation, but David cut him off. Money was no object. Time was no concern. He wanted the complete truth, no matter how ugly it became. The investigation would take 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which David's distraction became impossible to hide. The Japanese investors arrived to find him unprepared and unfocused. The Henderson acquisition stalled when he refused to authorize the final paperwork without additional environmental impact studies. Board meetings became exercises in damage control as David second-guessed decisions that had already been approved. Jennifer Torres cornered him again, this time with less subtlety. The board was concerned. Shareholders were asking questions. If David wasn't prepared to lead with the decisive vision that had built Apex Dynamics, perhaps it was time to consider alternative leadership structures. David listened to her veiled threats with detached interest. The empire he had built was preparing to devour him, just as it had devoured Sarah's dreams. The irony was poetic, but the timing was terrible. He needed to see Webb's investigation through before his own board staged their inevitable coup. Meanwhile, Sarah's life took another devastating turn. The eviction notice came with 48 hours warning, a legal technicality that allowed Hartwell Investments to claim breach of lease terms. She had been late with rent twice in the past year, both times by less than a week. Both times eventually paid in full, but the corporate lawyers had found their opening. She packed her belongings into boxes that reminded her of the ones she had filled when the tutoring center closed. The same cardboard containers, the same sense of dreams being dismantled and stored away. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, helped her load them into a borrowed truck. Both women pretended not to cry. Sarah's new address was a weekly rental in a neighborhood where hope went to die. The apartment was smaller, dirtier, and cost twice as much as her old place. But it was temporary, she told herself, a stepping stone until she could find something better. She didn't know that Hartwell Investments owned this building too. Webb's report arrived on a Friday that would be remembered as the day David Chen's empire began its final collapse. The document was 800 pages of meticulously researched devastation. Names, dates, communities, families, all the invisible casualties of his success story. The tutoring center was just the beginning. Millfield Plaza had housed 14 small businesses when Apex Dynamics acquired it for redevelopment. A family restaurant that had served the community for 30 years, a bookstore that had hosted reading groups for local children, a barbershop where 3 generations of the same family had worked, a dry cleaner owned by Vietnamese immigrants who had rebuilt their lives after losing everything in the war. All gone, all demolished to make way for luxury condominiums that sat half empty because the community could no longer afford to live in its own neighborhood. But the pattern extended far beyond one strip mall. Apex Dynamics had acquired and demolished 47 small business complexes over the past decade. Each acquisition was justified by sound business logic, underutilized real estate, inefficient use of prime locations, opportunities for higher density development. The human cost was documented in Webb's report like evidence in a war crimes tribunal. 533 small businesses destroyed, over 2,000 jobs eliminated, dozens of communities gentrified beyond recognition, and at the center of it all, David Chen, the spider in a web of systematic destruction. The report included photographs, before and after shots of neighborhoods that had been transformed by his investments, thriving communities replaced by sterile developments, diverse business districts converted to luxury housing that only the wealthy could afford. One photograph stopped David's breath entirely. It showed the demolition of Millfield Plaza, taken from across the street on the day the wrecking balls arrived. In the background, barely visible through the chain-link fence, was a figure watching the destruction. Even in the grainy photo, even at a distance, David recognized Sarah's silhouette. She had watched them destroy her dreams, had stood there as his machines tore down everything she had built. And now she cleaned the offices of the company that had ordered the demolition. Webb's investigation had uncovered one final devastating detail. The weekly rental where Sarah now lived was scheduled for demolition in 6 months. Hartwell Investments had plans to convert the entire block into luxury retail space. Sarah would be displaced again, pushed further from the city center, driven deeper into the margins of a community she had once been part of. David closed the report and walked to his windows. The city spread out below him, a testament to his success and a monument to his moral failure. Every building in his sightline had been touched by his influence. Every community had been reshaped by his investments. And in the mathematics of his empire, people like Sarah were simply variables to be optimized. The boy who had promised to change the world had succeeded. He had changed it into something uglier, colder, more efficient at converting human dreams into corporate profits. That evening, David made a series of phone calls that would either save his soul or destroy his empire. He called his lawyers and instructed them to halt all pending evictions from Hartwell properties. He called his development team and ordered them to suspend the Millfield redevelopment project. He called his CFO and authorized emergency rent assistance for displaced tenants. Each call generated new crises. The lawyers warned about breach of contract lawsuits. The development team explained about sunk costs and investor obligations. The CFO projected massive losses that would crater the quarterly earnings report. David listened to their objections with growing clarity. His empire was a machine designed to extract maximum profit from human misery. Every safeguard he tried to install generated resistance from systems optimized for efficiency over empathy. By midnight, he had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He opened his laptop and began drafting a memo that would either redeem Apex Dynamics or trigger its complete destruction. The memo was addressed to the board of directors and senior management. It outlined a comprehensive restructuring of company priorities, shifting from pure profit maximization to stakeholder capitalism. It proposed creating a community impact fund to compensate displaced businesses and families. It mandated environmental and social impact assessments for all future acquisitions. Most radically, it proposed using Apex Dynamics resources to rebuild rather than just demolish, to become a force for community development rather than community destruction. The memo was corporate suicide disguised as moral awakening. David knew the board would never approve it, but he also knew that Sarah was right. He had become exactly what they used to fight against. The boy who had written those earnest letters was finally ready to keep his promises, even if it meant destroying everything the man had built. David sealed the memo in an envelope and placed it on his desk where his assistant would find it in the morning. Then he sat back in his leather chair and watched the city sleep, wondering if redemption was possible for someone who had spent 20 years building an empire on other people's broken dreams. Tomorrow would bring the board meeting that would either transform Apex Dynamics or end David's career. Either way, the boy Sarah had once loved was finally ready to face the man he had become. The reckoning could no longer be delayed. The boardroom fell silent with the particular stillness that preceded corporate executions. David sat at the head of the polished table, watching 20 years of carefully cultivated relationships transform into cold calculation. The memo he had distributed that morning lay before each board member like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. Jennifer Torres held her copy between two fingers as if it were contaminated. The Japanese investors had departed that morning, citing concerns about Apex Dynamics' strategic direction. The Henderson acquisition had collapsed when David refused to sign the final papers without additional community impact assessments. Stock price had dropped 12% in 3 days. The financial press was speculating about leadership changes. 3 major clients had requested meetings to discuss the future of their partnerships. Torres spoke first, her voice carrying the measured tone of a surgeon discussing a terminal diagnosis. The board had concerns, serious concerns about David's recent decision-making. His behavior had become erratic, unprofessional, potentially damaging to shareholder interests. The memo he had circulated represented a fundamental departure from the company's core mission. She read from prepared notes, each point delivered with legal precision. David's unauthorized halt to eviction proceedings had exposed the company to breach of contract lawsuits totaling $47 million. His suspension of development projects had created cost overruns and regulatory complications. His public statements about corporate responsibility had triggered investigations by 3 regulatory agencies. Other voices joined the chorus. CFO Marcus Webb, not the investigator but a different Webb who had served Apex Dynamics for 8 years, outlined the financial impossibility of David's proposed reforms. The Community Impact Fund alone would cost hundreds of millions. The mandatory social assessments would slow acquisitions to a crawl. The shift from profit maximization to stakeholder capitalism would crater their competitive advantage. Webb's presentation was thorough and devastating. Charts showed projected revenue losses. Graphs illustrated competitive disadvantages. Risk assessments painted scenarios of company-wide layoffs, pension fund collapses, investor lawsuits. The mathematics of altruism, when applied to corporate governance, looked like economic suicide. Board member Richardson, who had been David's ally since the early days, looked genuinely pained as he spoke about fiduciary responsibility. They had a duty to shareholders, a legal obligation to maximize returns. David's moral awakening, however admirable personally, represented a breach of that duty. Personal ethics and corporate governance occupied different spheres of responsibility. Richardson's betrayal hurt more than Torres's calculated hostility. This was a man David had promoted from junior analyst to senior leadership, someone whose children called him Uncle David, someone who had shared countless meals, vacations, celebrations over the years. But friendship apparently had its limits when quarterly earnings were at stake. Board member Patricia Vance, the newest addition to their group, attempted a conciliatory tone. Perhaps there was middle ground, ways to incorporate some social responsibility initiatives without completely abandoning profit optimization, corporate social responsibility programs that generated positive publicity while maintaining financial discipline. David recognized the olive branch for what it was, a face-saving compromise that would allow everyone to claim moral victory while changing nothing fundamental about their business model. A few charitable donations, some positive press releases, maybe a scholarship fund that would cost less than their annual executive bonuses. When the voices stopped, David stood. The room tensed, expecting either capitulation or counterattack. Instead, he walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the city he had helped reshape. Construction cranes dotted the skyline like mechanical vultures, each one representing another community about to be transformed in the name of progress. He spoke about Sarah without naming her, about a woman whose life had been systematically destroyed by their success, about communities that had been erased to improve profit margins, about the mathematics of empire building, where human dreams were converted into shareholder value with ruthless efficiency. His voice remained calm, factual, as if he were presenting quarterly earnings rather than confessing to 20 years of systematic moral failure. Torres interrupted with practiced efficiency. Personal anecdotes were irrelevant to corporate governance. Individual hardship cases couldn't drive strategic decision-making. The board understood that business had social costs, but their responsibility was to shareholders, not to every displaced tenant or closed business. The invisible hand of the market, while sometimes cruel, ultimately created wealth that benefited everyone. David turned from the windows and faced the people who had helped him build his empire. He saw them clearly now. Intelligent, successful people who had perfected the art of not seeing what their decisions cost. They weren't monsters. They were worse than monsters. They were bureaucrats, systematically optimizing human misery while maintaining plausible deniability about the results. He told them about Webb's investigation, about the 533 businesses they had destroyed, about the communities they had gentrified into extinction, about the families they had displaced in pursuit of higher density development. He read names from the report: Mario's Family Restaurant, Chen's Bookstore, Patterson's Barbershop, each one representing decades of dreams dissolved for their profit margins. The numbers hung in the air like smoke from a crime scene. 533 businesses, 2,047 jobs, 68 communities fundamentally altered, 14 neighborhoods where longtime residents could no longer afford to live. Richardson shifted uncomfortably, but Torres remained unmoved. She acknowledged that development created displacement, that progress required sacrifice, that economic growth inevitably produced winners and losers. These were regrettable externalities, but they were also inevitable consequences of capitalism. The alternative, economic stagnation, would harm far more people than their development projects ever could. David realized he was listening to his own words from 5 years earlier. The same arguments he had used to justify the Millfield acquisition, the same logic that had allowed him to sleep peacefully while Sarah watched her dreams being demolished, the same moral framework that had converted human suffering into acceptable business costs. Torres continued her defense with increasing passion. Apex Dynamics employed 12,000 people directly and supported another 30,000 jobs through contractors and suppliers. Their projects created housing, retail space, office buildings that drove economic activity. Their investments attracted other businesses, generated tax revenue, improved property values. The creative destruction of capitalism was cruel but necessary. Tearing down the old to build something better. She was right, David realized. From a purely economic perspective, Apex Dynamics was a success story. They had created wealth, generated employment, contributed to urban development. The communities they had displaced were inefficient uses of prime real estate. The businesses they had shuttered were often struggling anyway. Their development projects did attract new investment and create new opportunities. But Sarah's tutoring center hadn't been inefficient. It had been serving its community's needs perfectly. The families they had displaced hadn't been economic deadweight. They had been people with roots, relationships, reasons for wanting to stay where they were. The neighborhoods they had gentrified hadn't been failing. They had been functioning differently than the economic models predicted. The vote, when it came, was swift and decisive. The board rejected his proposed reforms by a margin of 8-1. Richardson abstained, which David counted as a small victory. Torres moved to table the Community Impact Fund indefinitely. The motion passed unanimously. Then Torres moved to the real business of the meeting. She suggested that David might benefit from a sabbatical, extended time away to address whatever personal issues were affecting his judgment. The company needed steady leadership during these challenging times, perhaps 6 months in Europe, or a consulting role with reduced responsibilities. They could structure it as a leave of absence rather than a resignation, maintaining his dignity while protecting the company's interests. David understood the subtext perfectly. Accept voluntary exile or face involuntary removal. Step aside gracefully or be pushed aside messily. Either way, his time as CEO was ending. The empire he had built was preparing to devour him just as it had devoured Sarah's dreams. He could have fought, could have reminded them who had built this company from nothing, could have threatened to take his shares and his expertise to a competitor, could have made his removal as expensive and public as possible. His stock options alone gave him significant leverage. His knowledge of pending deals and strategic initiatives made him valuable to competitors. His relationships with clients and investors could be weaponized against the company he was leaving. Instead, he surprised them all. He accepted, not the sabbatical, not the graceful retirement with consulting fees and emeritus status. He accepted their judgment that he was no longer fit to lead the company he had created. But he also accepted something else, the moral clarity that came from finally seeing his life's work clearly. David announced his resignation as CEO, effective immediately. He would retain his shares but surrender his voting rights to a trust managed by independent advisors. He would step down from the board and cease all involvement in day-to-day operations. No golden parachute, no consulting arrangements, no face-saving transition period. The boardroom erupted in confusion. Torres had expected negotiation, compromise, face-saving measures that allowed everyone to maintain their dignity. Instead, David had given them everything they wanted while somehow making it feel like a defeat. Richardson looked stricken, as if he hadn't expected his betrayal to have such immediate consequences. But David wasn't finished. He announced his intention to establish the Sarah Kim Foundation, named for someone they wouldn't recognize, dedicated to supporting small businesses and communities affected by corporate development. He would fund it with his personal wealth, starting with a commitment of $50 million from his stock options and real estate holdings. The foundation would work with communities facing displacement, providing legal assistance, relocation support, and seed funding for new enterprises. It would offer microloans to entrepreneurs, particularly those from communities that had been affected by Apex Dynamics development projects. It would fund affordable housing initiatives and community development projects that prioritized people over profit margins. Most importantly, it would serve as a case study in stakeholder capitalism, proving that business could be a force for community building rather than community destruction. The foundation would document its work, publish case studies, and serve as a model for other wealthy individuals looking to use their resources more responsibly. Torres tried to interrupt, citing non-compete clauses and potential conflicts of interest, but David continued. He had reviewed his contracts carefully. Nothing prevented him from engaging in philanthropic work, even if that work competed with his former company's business model. The foundation would operate within legal boundaries while demonstrating alternatives to the scorched earth capitalism that Apex Dynamics represented. The room fell silent again as the board processed the implications. David was essentially using his Apex Dynamics fortune to compete with Apex Dynamics' business model. He was weaponizing his wealth against the system that had created it. The foundation would work in neighborhoods where Apex Dynamics planned to develop, supporting the communities they intended to displace. Vance asked about the practical implications. Would the foundation actively oppose Apex Dynamics projects? Would it fund legal challenges to their developments? Would it organize community resistance to their acquisitions? David smiled grimly. The foundation would support communities making their own decisions about development. if those communities chose to oppose Apex Dynamics projects, the foundation would provide resources for that opposition. If they chose to negotiate better terms, the foundation would support those negotiations. The foundation wouldn't declare war on Apex Dynamics, but it would level the playing field between corporate power and community interests. Torres tried one final gambit, suggesting that David's emotional state made him unsuitable for such significant financial commitments. Perhaps he should consider counseling, therapy, time to process whatever personal crisis had triggered this dramatic change in perspective. Mental health professionals who specialized in executive stress could help him work through these issues before making irreversible decisions. David smiled for the first time in weeks. He told them he had never been more clear about anything in his life. The boy who had once promised to change the world was finally ready to keep that promise, even if it meant destroying everything the man had built in the meantime. Richardson made one last attempt at reconciliation, suggested that maybe David was right about some things, that perhaps the company could find ways to be more socially responsible while maintaining profitability. Maybe they could work together on reforms that addressed his concerns without threatening the company's competitive position. But David was done with compromise, done with half measures that maintain the appearance of social responsibility while changing nothing fundamental about their business model. He had tried reform from within and been rejected unanimously. Now he would pursue reform from without, using the wealth they had helped him accumulate to demonstrate alternatives to their approach. The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like treaty signatures after a war nobody had won. David packed his personal items while security watched, a standard precaution when executives departed under unusual circumstances. 20 years of empire building reduced to 2 cardboard boxes and a potted plant his assistant had given him for Christmas 3 years earlier. That evening, David sat in his empty office one final time, looking out at the city that would no longer be his responsibility to reshape. Somewhere in that maze of lights and shadows, Sarah was finishing another shift, unaware that the man who had destroyed her business had just destroyed his own empire in response. The irony was perfect and terrible. He had finally found the courage to act on his principles, but only after becoming so morally compromised that redemption seemed impossible. The boy Sarah had loved would have been proud of his decision. The man she now despised had lost the right to expect her forgiveness. David's phone buzzed with a text from building security. There was a package waiting for him at the front desk. No sender listed, no return address. He took the elevator down to the lobby where he had first seen Sarah again, where their paths had crossed after 20 years of parallel lives. The package was small, wrapped in brown paper with his name written in handwriting he would have recognized in any context. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, the same kind she had used for her devastating letter. The message was brief. "I heard about your resignation. The boy I used to know would have been proud. That doesn't change what the man did, but it's a start. No signature, no return address, no promise of forgiveness or reconciliation, but acknowledgement. Recognition that destruction could be the first step toward reconstruction, that the boy's idealism channeled through the man's resources might accomplish something worthwhile. For the first time in months, David felt like he might be able to sleep without dreaming of demolished buildings and broken promises. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of rebuilding, not in glass and steel, but in the communities his empire had helped destroy. The foundation would be his letter of apology to everyone he had failed, written in actions instead of words. It wouldn't bring back Sarah's tutoring center. It wouldn't undo 20 years of systematic community destruction, but it might prevent future Sarah Kims from watching their dreams being demolished for quarterly profit margins. The boy who had once promised to change the world was finally ready to begin. 6 months later, David stood in the ruins of Millfield Plaza, watching bulldozers tear down what was left of his former empire's legacy. The Sarah Kim Foundation had purchased the site from Hartwell Investments at market value, a transaction that had cost him $12 million and generated headlines about corporate executives buying back their own mistakes. The financial press had called it everything from brilliant public relations to elaborate penance. David called it Tuesday. The luxury condominiums that had replaced Sarah's tutoring center stood half-finished, abandoned when construction loans dried up after Apex Dynamics' stock price collapsed. The new board, led by Torres, had implemented aggressive cost-cutting measures that ironically made David's original reforms look conservative. 3,000 jobs eliminated, 7 development projects canceled, share value down 60% from its peak. David felt no satisfaction watching his former company's struggles. Apex Dynamics' decline had hurt people, employees, contractors, communities that had depended on their investments. The invisible hand of the market was equally invisible when it came to moral judgment. Good intentions and evil ones produced the same unemployment statistics, but Millfield Plaza would rise again. Not as luxury housing, but as something closer to what it had been. Small businesses, community spaces, affordable retail that served the neighborhood rather than replaced it. The foundation had spent months in community meetings, listening to residents describe what they actually wanted rather than what economic models suggested they needed. Sarah had attended one of those meetings. David had seen her from across the room, gray hair pulled back, wearing a dress that suggested she was no longer working night shifts. She had spoken during the public comment period, her voice carrying the same quiet authority he remembered from their college days. She talked about small businesses as community anchors, about the difference between development that served people and development that displaced them. She hadn't looked at him, hadn't acknowledged his presence, but she had stayed for the entire meeting, listening as community members shared their dreams for the site. An elderly man who wanted to reopen his barbershop, a young woman with plans for a community garden, a group of teenagers who envisioned a space for after-school tutoring. After the meeting, David had waited in the parking lot, hoping she might approach him. Instead, he had watched her drive away in a car that looked reliable rather than desperate. The foundation's work had been good for many people in the neighborhood. Apparently, Sarah was among them. The foundation's first annual report lay on his desk in the modest office he had rented above a coffee shop. 53 small businesses supported, 47 families assisted with relocation costs, 18 community development projects funded. The numbers were tiny compared to Apex Dynamics' scale, but they represented something different, growth that built up rather than tore down. David's personal wealth had shrunk considerably. The foundation's commitments, combined with his divorce settlement, Patricia had remarried within a year, taking half their assets to fund a lifestyle that didn't include reformed corporate executives, had reduced him from multi-millionaire to comfortable middle class. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and drove a car that was practical rather than prestigious. The transformation felt like learning to breathe underwater. Everything familiar had been replaced by something alien but sustainable. He slept better, ate better, looked in mirrors without flinching. The boy Sarah had loved might not recognize the life he was living, but he would approve of its direction. The phone rang. His assistant, a part-time college student who worked between classes, announced that someone wanted to see him. No appointment, no name given, just a woman who said she had business with the foundation. David looked up from his reports to find Sarah standing in his doorway. She looked different. Not younger, the years were still visible in the lines around her eyes, the silver threading through her hair, but lighter somehow, less careful. The hypervigilance of someone living paycheck to paycheck had been replaced by something closer to peace. She told him about her new job. The foundation's microloan program had helped her friend Maria open a restaurant in the neighborhood where Sarah had been displaced. Maria needed someone to manage the books, handle suppliers, train new staff, someone with experience in small business operations and a degree in education that had been gathering dust for 20 years. The pay was modest but steady. The work was meaningful but manageable. For the first time in years, Sarah had a single job that paid enough to live on, in a community where she felt like a person rather than an invisible service provider. David listened without interrupting, afraid that words might break whatever spell had brought her to his office. She spoke about the neighborhood meetings, the community garden, the tutoring program that reminded her why she had wanted to teach in the first place. The Millfield redevelopment was creating exactly the kind of community spaces she had once dreamed of building. When she finished, silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Finally, Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Yellowed paper, careful handwriting, a return address that belonged to their shared past. David recognized it immediately, the letter she had written him during their senior year, the one he had been too busy building his empire to read. She placed it on his desk without ceremony, her fingers not quite touching the surface where his hands rested. She told him she had found it while packing up her old apartment, mixed in with tax documents and medical bills. 20 years later, she had finally read it herself, a young woman's letter to a young man she had thought she would spend her life with. The promises had been beautiful. The dreams had been genuine. The boy who had inspired those words deserved to know what they said. Sarah left without saying goodbye, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell as she descended to the street. David sat alone in his small office, staring at the envelope that contained words from a woman who had loved him before he learned to love money more than people. Outside his window, Millfield Plaza was being rebuilt with community input rather than shareholder demands. Small businesses were preparing to open, families were planning to stay rather than being forced to leave. The invisible hand of the market was being guided by visible hands that belonged to people who lived in the neighborhood. David opened the letter with the same careful precision he had once applied to merger documents. The handwriting was young, hopeful, written by someone who believed that love and ambition could coexist without corruption. "David," it began, "I know you're going to change the world. I just hope you remember to let the world change you too." The letter went on for 3 pages, full of dreams and promises that felt like messages from another planet. Sarah, at 21, had written about the business they would build together, the community they would serve, the children they would teach to believe in something better than they had inherited. The boy who had received this letter had been too busy becoming successful to read it. The man who finally read it understood that some promises could only be kept by breaking everything else first. David folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer next to the foundation's annual report and the lease for a building that would house small businesses instead of luxury condominiums. The boy Sarah had loved was gone, but his dreams had finally found someone worthy of keeping them. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent 20 years accumulating power to change the world, only to discover that real change required giving that power away. The foundation operated on a fraction of Apex Dynamics' budget, but its impact felt more substantial than anything he had accomplished in glass towers and boardrooms. Every family that stayed in their neighborhood, every small business that survived and thrived, every community meeting where residents shaped their own future, these were victories measured in human terms rather than quarterly earnings. David's phone buzzed with a text from Maria's restaurant. They needed help with their supplier contracts, and Sarah had suggested he might have some insights. It was the first time Sarah had referenced him in any communication since her visit. A small bridge, perhaps, not back to who they had been, but forward to who they might become as allies in the work of rebuilding. He looked at the message and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the anticipation of work that mattered to people he cared about. The boy who had wanted to teach children alongside Sarah had finally found his classroom. It was messier than he had imagined, more complicated than his youthful idealism had anticipated, but it was real in ways his empire had never been. The foundation's success stories weren't perfect. Some businesses failed despite support. Some families were displaced by forces beyond their control. Some communities remained fractured by decades of systematic neglect. But the failures felt honest now, mistakes made while trying to do good rather than collateral damage from pursuing profit. Outside, the city hummed with the complex mathematics of human ambition, dreams being built and destroyed in the endless cycle of creative destruction. But in Millfield Plaza, something different was being constructed, a community that grew from the ground up rather than being imposed from above. David typed his response to Maria's request, offering to review their contracts pro bono. It wasn't the empire he had once dreamed of building. It was something smaller, more fragile, more human. It was something the boy who had written those earnest letters would have recognized as worth building.